This is a Leadership Breakdown podcast. I'm Kylie Ota, intuitive business strategist and leadership coach. I'm here to break down the strategies for leadership and to address the breakdown that is happening in our leadership today. So let's break it down, shall we? Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Breakdown podcast. I'm here today with Rachel Anderson, who is the owner of Human-Centric Leader. Oh my gosh. Isn't that such a perfect person to be on the podcast today? If you've been following my brand at all, you know that I'm 100% about human-centered leadership, just human-centric everything. Is part of my background is I had burnout in corporate, and it was because I was not following anything human-centric. I was going with the workflow and not my own flow. And that's what led to my burnout. And that's how I became a coach. And I think Rachel will share a similar story today. And without further ado, welcome Rachel to the program.
Thank you, Kylie. I'm so excited to be here. And I think you and I are going to have a really great conversation.
Yeah. So just give us a little background on like your leadership journey and how you became a human-centric leadership coach.
Absolutely. So my journey really began when I first got into technology. That was not my first job by any means, but it was definitely the one that started me down this path, asking the question, what does it really mean to lead from an authentic place, from a place that wanted to prioritize humans in the workplace and kind of the business world, and who did I want to be personally as a manager, as an employee? And so about, 15 years ago, I guess, that was my first big move, was going into technology and going into a Fortune 500 company. I did not know any better. I was a very naive little Rachel walking in on the scene. And before that, I had really worked with, nonprofits and done some PR work. That was kind of my background. And as I got in, I just realized there's such a difference in priorities and what it meant to be productive, in how people were engaged sort of as a very, very hierarchical system, which was true of a lot of things, right? Even in schools, when you're going through your educational years, it's hierarchical, but there just was something really different about that moment. But honestly, I loved technology, and my first job was in an open source company, and I loved that too, the idea of it, the concepts of it. And so I stuck with technology, and I ended up moving a few years after being there and starting to experience different jobs and teams and management styles and leadership and organizational structures. And I kept noticing that there was this idea coming from executive teams, because I was in communications early on, and then I moved into marketing as like my big bread and butter, and that's where I developed most of my career. But I always then worked very closely with executives, just kind of as the path. And so as I would talk to them, I would really see that there was sort of this if-or mentality, that we could either prioritize humans as part of our central culture and business development angle, or we can make profit. We can have big revenue goals and we can achieve that. And I can't say that it was intentional from that leadership perspective, but what I found is that doesn't fit for me. My personality, my upbringing, the things I care about is always the human. And so as I had, again, my career morphing into management and running processes and really looking at organizational structures and marketing strategies and all that like good greatness that comes from marketing, in my opinion, I realized that I needed to figure it out for my own. And so the COVID years really were the ones that catapulted me into what does it mean for me to lead? How do I lead from a human, empathetic, and authentic perspective? I was able to test a ton what worked and what didn't work when managing internationally, remote, hybrid, complex. Right. And I found in that year that I had 300% growth on my team because of the brand of leadership I had, the trust that organizational leaders had in me and my skills and my team's work. I had 100% retention on my team for 2 years. I also had a reflection of 27% productivity and revenue growth. So there were just incredible results from this different way to do. and to be a manager. And that's really the birthplace of human-centric leadership.
Wow. I mean, a lot of what, you described similar to my path as well. And I think a lot of women, especially when we're working in these, more, let's just say, since we're saying human-centric or male-centric companies and regimes, and I say regimes because what you were talking about, it's a very old mindset, right? That has been passed down since the industrial age, with the hierarchy and all of that. And with everything that's going on in today's world and society and the way things are shifting with, gender roles and things. At one point, I was the breadwinner in my family and I was higher up. My husband and I worked in the same company, but I was higher up in that company. It in this day and age, it doesn't really matter where you are or who you are to, you know, grow and become a leader. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally correct. I mean, we women are now working within a system that was never designed for us. And I think that there's, not to lay blame, because as an evolutionary perspective, like way back, like lizard brain cells, there were always two different roles. There were the roles for those that went out and hunted. There were those that protected. There were those that maintained the familial structure and the campsites and the farming, right? So it's fine for there to have been a system designed for one kind of provider, one kind of individual. But now in the Western societies that at least you and I live in, that structure, in my opinion, is outdated because it wasn't designed for the complexity that we now have. And I would say that's even true, taking the gender piece out for just a minute, but using examples like remote work or Wi-Fi. Yes. Like the working system wasn't even created for the technology we have today. And so not only as like a total side note, I could talk about this for like an hour. Like I think productivity, the idea of productivity needs to change because of it. And that's part of what I talk about with human-centric leadership. But going back to this like conflict between men and women, the question I get a lot then from leaders is, how do women then succeed and thrive within an organization or a system that wasn't designed for them, even in the best of intentions? If you have, a leadership team that's just like, we really want to see you succeed, we'll do everything we can to make a way for you. And just, it's the structure, and you have to figure out ways around that.
Yeah, totally. As we were talking about this, like, how did this become something that you are so passionate about? Because I feel it. I feel your passion, and your passion meets mine because, my gosh, working in oil and gas for 19 years, it's like, hey, that's really an old regime, old
Yeah.
mindset. And luckily, I had a leadership counterpart who was on the path and still is on the path. She's still there working to create a more human-centric environment. But yeah, just how did this become so much of your passion?
So I have almost always, as long as I can remember, just deeply cared about women's rights, the way that they can be platformed well. I was even in an all women's leadership group when I was younger and never knew that it was a different way when you get into the, quote unquote real world as a kid, until I hit the real world. And at that point, because I think I was so privileged to see what it could be like with women as leaders. And it was nothing special. It was just the normalcy of the fact that women were allowed to lead. That was really the absurdity, sort of. And then to get into this, to your exact point, very male-dominated industry. This tech maybe is new industry versus oil and gas is definitely like old industry, but male-dominated.
Very male.
Yeah, very male. I know. I had to struggle to even claim a right as a woman to be at the table, let alone just assume that, my needs were the same as anyone else's. One of my big sticking points especially back then, but like, I see it now too, is when people are like, oh, well, like you have a male leader and he's like, well, how do I really mentor my female report? And I'm like, the same way you
Same
do
way
your
you
male
meant it.
report. There is no difference. Like our unique needs as humans, yes, might be different, especially when you talk about maternity leave, because there's a burden on us simply for the fact that biology exists. So yeah, there are certain things that are different, but when you talk about mentorship and help and advice, it's all the same. And so, one of the things that really started to draw me was actually this concept of open source culture. So just in case, you probably are familiar, but for listeners, there's open source and there's closed source when it comes to software. And closed source basically says there's only a few developers that can look at the code and really see what's going on in the back end, put something together or develop something new, and then put it back into the software and let you, the user, only see the pretty parts that are like on the forefront, right?
I'll put my neck out there. So that would be Apple
Yeah,
products.
yeah. Apple is a great example. Honestly, it's most software. Like if you use anything on your phone and you can't personally access the code, which is probably 95% of what you have, closed source software. And you know what? That's fine. It is what it is. But open source mentality, and especially software, is basically saying, hey, we're going to let everybody see the code. Anybody can use it, can develop it, can tweak it. The only legal requirement for it is that you then never charge for it. And a lot of times, if you're doing some sort of open source development, you often put it back into the community so that then other people can also tweak it, change it, see it. And
Right.
the great thing about this concept that I think, why don't we do more of these things, is that with closed source software, you only have a certain number of people, which means those people are restrained by hours, expertise, availability. But with open
Right.
source software, you have an unending number of people that could potentially work on something, improve it, find bugs, put time into it, put it back into the world for the next person to work on it. And so it has the opportunity to be expanded and refined and made into something really incredible really quickly. And
Yeah.
then on top of that, kind of merging with like our conversation about women, I see the same for us. And when we go into the work world, in this closed source system, there's only a couple
Yes.
people who can possibly lead, who can possibly succeed and have, power or authority or success, however you want to define that as. And that's really the system that has evolved over these hundreds and hundreds of years. Even if you think back in I think it was just after the Industrial Revolution, the common prevailing leadership theory was that if you were just a smarter person, then you became a leader. And it was just about you're born with it, it was like the old Maybelline, maybe she was born with it, maybe it's Maybelline. Well, they're maybe they're born with it and maybe that's it. I don't know, right?
Right.
That
We think leaders are born.
Right.
No.
Right.
Yes,
But
go
yeah,
ahead.
so anyway, so now, people don't think that quite as much, but there's still this closed source mentality. And I really believe that if women adopted an open source mentality, we would win so fast. If we were like, hey, I'm going to get up there, I'm going to get in the closed source, I'm going to do the thing, I'm going to get on the executive team, I'm going to be an incredible manager, and then you pull other women into that process, into that board meeting, into that leadership opportunity, instead of seeing it as finite power, saying, no, I'm going to expand the availability of this power, then we really
Yes,
all win.
we do. And the funny thing is that you have some women who are open to more open source thinking, but then you have women who are not. They're like, hey, I got here on my own merit. You guys have to earn your way to the table as well. And it's like, man, how can we as women develop more of that open source thinking, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. You know what's so funny about that? I forgot about this until you said something. Several years ago, I was sitting at a Starbucks just working on my laptop, and this random woman came over to me and was just like, hey, can we share a table? And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. I'm waiting for a friend of mine and we were going to work together. But you're more than welcome to sit down. There's 3 seats here, have at. And she just started talking to me about random things in the world. And her opening question was, well, what do you think women could do to help win? Win in the world, right? What's the top issue? That's what it was. What's the top issue women are facing that would allow them to succeed more in the world? And I was just like, wow. First of all, you just asked a total stranger this really deep question. I'm very impressed by you. I'm just putting that out there.
I'm just
I like
here
it.
waiting for my coffee.
I know.
By the way, let's have some earth-shattering conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so my response to her was, if women especially under the conversation for women of which one is harder, to be a stay-at-home mom or to be a working mom. If we stopped fighting about that, we would immediately make advancements for everybody. Like if we decided, no, that's something that the men argue about, the women acknowledge that it's hard both ways. And
Right.
therefore
And
we're
it's
going to
yes
find,
and.
yeah, exactly. And if we find ways to advocate for and find improvements for both of those scenarios, we are so powerful together.
Yes. And I know we could definitely go on a rabbit hole, but the income opportunities for women now with the technology that we were talking about earlier, it's huge. I mean,
Yes.
you could start a TikTok channel or a YouTube channel today, like Clean Talk. Who knew Clean Talk would take off? I mean, that's such an open source income stream for stay-at-home moms, and there's a lot of software out there and technology that make it easier for us as women to do that, right?
Yes.
Because I use a lot of software that you don't need to learn coding, or there's so many technologies that I use in my business that are very tech friendly, because it's not just women who have technology challenges. Like there are a lot of men who I've had as clients that technology is not their strong suit, like they're more right brain than left brain. And for me, luckily, I'm like 49%, 51%, like both brained. So
It's very
it
lucky.
helps me to see both sides. It allows me to flow in the creative, and then it allows me to flow in that and like kind of merge them together, which makes me a really great strategist, especially like workflows and automations and things. Like I will see the patterns. I'm like, okay, ding, ding, ding. Like if that's what you want to do, like this is how you would set it up. People are like, how do you do that? I'm like, I don't know. I just I see it in my head. There's like a perpetual whiteboard that just it flows. I have like
Yeah.
flow charts
It's
flowing
like
in my
Minority
head.
Report when you're just like swiping things through the air and yeah.
I'm gonna use that because that's
Yeah.
literally what it is. I'm like,
Feel free.
you know, and And it was funny we were talking about like women in the workplace. So I had built up credibility with my peers, but when we would get, outside like SMEs that would come in, things like that, it was so weird. They automatically assumed I was the secretary or executive assistant when I was sitting in the room. And because I was, good with the computer, because a lot like in oil and gas, a lot of the men were more mechanically inclined versus technically inclined, right? But it was a skill set that, I mean, I love to play with technology. That's why you and I get along so well.
Yeah.
But, so I'm there behind the computer because, I can run a PowerPoint. I can do a lot of those things in my sleep, that the other men couldn't. And so they automatically assumed that I was not sitting at the table. Because at
Hmm.
times I was not actually sitting at the actual table because, the presentation computer was set up on the side. So I was actually sitting at the presentation computer. So
Mm.
they assumed that I was not at the table. I'm like, oh no. And in fact, I'm at the head table because
Yeah.
I'm leading this joint, but welcome to my table, you know?
Yeah.
There was a lot of ego that I know I had to get over. Like, like, oh, I'm so frustrated that I wasn't seen as a leader. And it took a lot of leadership development on my part to say, hey, like, yes, people may see you in this way, but it's up to you to dissuade them and not prove. There was a lot of proving energy. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong. There was a lot of proving energy that I went through, but eventually I realized it's not necessarily who I I am or like who I'm proving myself to be. It's inherently who I am on the inside that
Hmm.
makes me a leader. Like who am I? How am I showing up? How am I handling the misgivings? How am I handling these situations that once I hit that, it propelled me. Once I like got over myself, it propelled me because I said, no, I was the one that was holding myself back from leadership because I was taking on their labels, their identities. I'm like, I am my own person. And if I'm going to be in this company, I was with that company for 19 years until I decided to go into full-time entrepreneurship
Mm.
in leadership capacity again. It was until I decided to take the reins into my own hands, things started to shift. So can you tell us more about that, and like how can more women just begin to win in the workplace?
Yeah, I think your example is really fantastic and your conclusion. I love that you got there because, yes, we talked about the system was not built for us, but that doesn't make us powerless in that system. That just means that we have to approach things sometimes differently or expect certain things to be true and have strategies for how to change them. And that's
Yes.
where sometimes having people outside of your own person or even people like on your team, like your work bestie or whatever, like it's important to have a
Work
mentor, a
besties were
coach.
so important for
So
me.
important.
Having the other
Statistically,
ladies,
yeah,
oh my gosh, it was so
they're critical.
important.
Yeah. And
Yes.
so important to have, but like outside of that context, it's really important to have other people that can help advise and coach you, especially as a manager, especially as a new manager, to figure out how to really thrive within this context and have the right kind of tools. There was a recent article that was published by, I think it was McKinley and Lean In. I think they did a partnership, and it said that
Okay.
women were twice as likely to be interrupted or mistaken for being more junior in a meeting than their male counterparts, which is
Yeah.
exactly what you're
What
talking
I've
about.
experienced. Yeah.
And I had a very similar experience. I mean, I've had several of those instances where I've had to mark out my boundary as a accomplished and leadershipful human who is also here in this meeting to contribute. But I think of one in particular because I talk a lot to women about non-promotable work and being really careful about accidentally getting non-promotable work. So for me, there was a company I was working at several years ago now that I was running processes and teams and all these different things. And I was voluntold by the VP that I was going to be on what was called the fun committee, where I was to represent and have office events planned. And I was
Right.
not thrilled because I'd already said I wouldn't do it and was like, okay, I'll go. And sure enough, I was the only female present. And everybody just sort of was like, you have natural leadership abilities, because I wanted them to have, I don't know, an agenda or like a process or stay on task. Like,
Right?
if I'm going to be here, let's
Meeting
make it
basics
valuable.
101.
Right, exactly. And so they're like, you should lead and you should take notes and all these things. And I went back to the VP and I was like, I don't know what to do because I don't have time for this. I don't have time for this to be my job. And she gave me great advice. She said, then you say yes to leading and you make it your job to delegate. And I was like,
Yeah.
and so I went back in and I sure did. And it became very successful. So I created my boundary of non-promotable work, and that no, I'm not doing the notes just because I have two hands. I'm not going to take on all the responsibilities just simply because I can. I'm going to take on one thing that will benefit my life, process, clarity, leadership, makes my life smoother in that meeting. And I will allow everyone else to also participate fully in making these things happen by doing all the other things. My contribution is the leadership. And so
Right.
that became great, and we were thriving, and it was a much better meeting going forward. I think I was part of that for, at least a year, and it was much smoother. And so I think with women specifically, we do often have that default, and it comes from both men and women, older women that have succeeded and have had to play the game because that was the only choice they had. And it is because of those women who played the game, I now have a different option. And so I
Yes.
appreciate that and I deeply value that. And I'm going to choose to do it slightly different by setting my boundary and really making sure that the other people in the room understand the value of my contribution.
Exactly. Right. We need to evolve leadership, right?
Yes.
If we've gotten to the table, but if we're going to leave the table place settings the same, like, no, we're in a new season,
Right.
right? Like, you don't leave the fall decorations during Christmas time, like, you change it. We're in a
Yeah.
new season. And I think if we as women leaders recognize that this is a new season, we are coming into a new season of leadership. I mean, with the election, at the time of this recording, the election has not happened yet. So, right, we have two candidates. And like our first, well, we had one prior, but like he's up against a woman again. And, we just have to see where the leadership in this country takes us. And we're not going to get super political here, but I'll just say I am not thrilled with the, like how, she's being presented to the world as a woman leader. But, it is how it is. But it's up to us women to keep changing the narrative of women in leadership.
Yeah. And I think a really good addition to that, I listened to this podcast several years ago and it deeply imprinted itself on me. It was one of Malcolm Gladwell's very first episodes of Revolutionist History. And I'm being specific about it because he talks about a phenomenon and I can't remember what it was called. So if people want to look it up, you should go listen to that episode. It's one of the very first ones. But he talks about this phenomenon where the first person, I'm going to say minority as a broad sweeping of like you're just not the majority. But the first minority to break into something takes years and years and years of struggle. It's all the things. And then you finally do. And everyone is like, wow, everything's going to be different. And he talked about how this has been seen in several different things, but he used the example of the art galleries back in, England, back in the day, where that was the form of entertainment, as you went to the art galleries and you looked at all of the beautiful paintings and sculptures and things that, artists of their time really contributed. And the first woman made her way into the front room, which was considered the most exclusive. That was reserved for the artists that actually could make a living doing their art. And so it was a big deal that she was featured in that very first room. And they thought for sure that that would just open the gates for women everywhere to be able to really platform and be seen as equals on the art scene. And in fact, it took decades for the next female to be in that room, because there's this phenomenon that once the majority has the first one, it checks the box, and then they don't think that it's as important anymore, and it takes a long, long time for the second to be seen in that same capacity. So my encouragement would be, regardless of what happens in the elections, if we have the first, or if we need to have another first candidate that potentially is female, or whatever that looks like, we can't stop after we get the first. We can't stop really trying to pull other people in with us, right? There's the phrase of rising tides raise all ships. But if it's just one tide, one time, it's not going to keep them getting higher and higher. And so that's one of the reasons why I really think, with human-centric leadership, we have an opportunity to expand the available space for us as women in leadership, in roles that can make a difference for other women. And it's our responsibility to pull other people into that with us, not just as a first, but as an ongoing effort to provide opportunity and balance.
Oh my gosh, I love that. And then as, we start to wrap up this episode, I was thinking about more resources that we could provide to the women. And you have a book that's coming out, or that may already be live when this goes public.
Yes.
Tell me more about that, because, I've authored a book as well, but it's more of a fiction book, like a memoir fiction
It's hard,
book.
right? That's what I've learned so far. It's so hard.
hard, and just talking about how we've, grown when it comes to being authors, even like the authorship. Before, it was so hard to break into that industry. Now, with technology and, availability, I could self-publish a book.
Yeah.
I didn't. I did. I went with a company because I wanted, that support, but I have met other women on my journey in entrepreneurship that I'm like, oh yeah, I've written a book and I self-published. I'm like, oh, that is so amazing, right?
Yeah.
The barriers are broken.
Yeah. Yeah. The barriers are broken. I'm searching for a title. So maybe you and I should chat about The Barriers Are Broken. That's a great title.
Yeah.
So basically, I'm writing a book about human-centric leadership, and it's really talking about how prioritizing the human, the health, the well-being, and the development of the individual specifically on the
Yeah.
path to achievement is how we win as leaders, as societies, as businesses. There's actual like monetary value to prioritizing the human element as we grow and change. And so the whole book is exploring the evolution of work and how that has made things difficult, and what does it mean to redefine productivity, and how do we protect that and encourage that as leaders. And I specifically have a chapter dedicated to women and people that want to support women. And I can't let it go. It's just so important to me that I was like, even if it's this general leaders book, I have to take one for the team here. Like we have to talk about the fact that we can truly deeply win if we embrace a different way to lead, and really support each other in the
100%. And that's pretty much the premise of this podcast as well. Breaking down specific leadership strategies that will help women, not only in the workplace, but in wherever they lead. You could be the leader of your home. Right? We talked
That's
about
right.
stay-at-home moms versus, women in the workplace. Being a leader in the home is essential because you are building the future leaders. I want to say America, like, this podcast is worldwide. You're building the future leaders. As a mom, I'll just say I didn't do 100% good job. Being a mom was not on my like the top of my list because of uh, the obligations that I had to my corporate job. And I got tired of it. And I thought that my kids would eventually like learn how to do the things that they need to do. Like they would learn how to be good and effective humans because, hey, the school system supports, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I learned the hard way that the systems that were already in place to raise our children were not acceptable to me and how I wanted my children to be raised. I mean, and so by virtue of that, I I was blindsided by, you know, the well, not deficiencies, because not that my kids are deficient, but they had deficiencies in their own self-leadership. We'll just put it that way. And they took different paths that I was like, how did this happen? As a woman who thought that I was at the top of my game in all stages of, like with, with work, with home, like I thought I was checking all the boxes. And I neglected leading in my own home or and leading to nurture, right? Because there's leading, I mean, this is probably a whole nother podcast, but leading to nurture versus leading to lead, and
Yeah,
just nurturing the next generation of humans is a totally important job.
it
So, I
is.
mean, I don't know where you are listening to this, but if you are working or if you're, a stay-at-home mom, or if you're like in between and you are raising your children while also building a side hustle or side hustle wanting to turn into a full-time hustle, you know, leadership and focusing on building the next generation of leaders is so important. Whether we're doing it in the workplace, we're building up the next generation that is going to surpass us when we leave.
Mhm.
Building up the next generation of leaders is like it's one of my passions.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that that's incredibly true. I mean, I do not have kids, so I can only say what I see, which is that most moms that I know and love, friends of mine who have kids, mentors, etc., are so hard on themselves about the jobs that they do. And it's really, really hard. I was really lucky that I got to nanny for a short period of time early on
Mm.
because I got to see firsthand what two working parents in the household looked like. And I was absolutely mortified at the idea that someone would be a single parent because I helped them with basic household tasks as well as making sure that one child at the time was safe and healthy and happy. And I don't know how you do it alone. And so as someone who just sees the incredible working skills that moms in the home have, your event planning, your operationally aligning your entire team, the AKA the family unit, to goals, being somewhere, being a kind of person, having certain values. I mean, the skills that you're using are not that far off from the skills that are needed in the business world.
And your CFO,
right? Yeah, right.
And your
exactly.
manufacturing, your purchasing.
Yes, yeah.
Right?
There's so much. And so I just want to tell anyone who's listening that's just like, man, I just feel like I'm constantly not doing a good job as a woman, mother, employee / manager. I would say, I think you're doing an incredible job. And that those things were not meant for one person. Those are too many roles. That's like 3 separate full-time jobs. So you're doing great. Also, I just have to side note, men couldn't even handle certain like basic administrative tasks as part of their job responsibility. And that's why we have the admin era, because they all needed secretaries. So if you're out there and you're a mom, you may not be able to have one, but you deserve a secretary at the very least. You deserve some like assistance 8 hours a day.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so true. Well, this is a very great segment to end on. And where else can we find you online? Like, right when your book comes out, like we'll update the show notes, but just tell us where they can find you and if they want to learn more about human-centric leadership and what work you're doing in the world to help women and propel us to be better leaders.
Yeah. So you can, of course, I'd love to connect with anyone on LinkedIn. I also have a TikTok and a Instagram at the Human-Centric Leader, but my website is also a great place that you can get all of that information from one place. So it's the human-centricleader.com. And you can also sign up for a preview of the wait list for the book, or if this is out after it launches, you can get the book there too. And I'd love to connect.
Yes. Oh my gosh. It's been so lovely connecting with you today.
I agree.
Yeah, we're going to stay friends and I'm going to find you
Yes.
on LinkedIn as well. And I can't wait to continue this conversation offline.
Perfect. This is great, Kylie. Thank you so much.
So we'll see you guys again next time on the Leadership Breakdown podcast. Bye. Thanks for listening to the Leadership Breakdown podcast. If you're ready to break free from the overwhelm and finally create the impact you've been working so hard for, I want you to grab the Leadership Legacy Playbook. This guide gives you the exact strategies to lead with purpose and leave your mark on the world. Don't keep putting off the legacy that you want to build. Grab the link in the show notes and start building your legacy today.